Hello and welcome to MUSI260. Today we're going to be looking at MIDI and electronic music production, the history of. Okay, so let's get started. So MIDI stands for Musical Instrument Digital Interface, which of course we knew that already, but we're going to go over a few things along the way. One thing to remember is that MIDI is not an audio interface. It's a computer interface. Devices that have a MIDI interface contain a small computer that processes the MIDI data, drum machines, synthesizers, and the like. For example, a sound module with a MIDI interface contains a computer that controls the sound generator, and the computer inside the MIDI keyboard watches the keys and sends a message from the MIDI out port when we press a key. In modern DAWs, it's the MIDI clips that hold the note information. So before MIDI, in the olden days, before MIDI, how analog synths spoke to each other was control voltage, known as CV. So this control voltage and the gate trigger system was pretty limited in what you'd actually get. It was great for sending stop-start information to onboard sequences and what have you, but that was pretty much it was pretty limited with what you could do there. So lots of analog synths, they rely on physical knobs and sliders, patch cables, manual programming. So a lot of reaching around to automate sections, or rather sections that would have been automated, that you're actually reaching over and manually controlling. There was also no universal standard for the way CV control should work. So this was quite frustrating if you had a number of different synths that you wanted to speak to each other. So, for example, if you had a couple of Korg synthesizers, you would pretty much know that they would be able to speak with each other. But once you looked at getting a synthesizer from another manufacturer, say a Yamaha synthesizer, you wouldn't know if that would be able to talk happily with your Korg synthesizers. So the great thing now, of course, is that the majority of CV-controlled synths can also be adapted with a CV to MIDI converter, so you can use MIDI to control them as well. Okay, so to move past this whole idea of CV and control, we needed to have a vision. And during the late 70s and the early 80s, the rise of more affordable synthesizers from companies such as Roland, Yamaha, and Korg, in particular, these were Japanese companies, saw a conversation evolve in regard to compatibility and communication between the brands and the models of synthesizers. And in 1981, the idea of a universal digital language started to come about. In 1982, there was a meeting between the major American and Japanese manufacturers, which laid the groundwork for the protocol. And by 1983, as the industry moved towards a digital computer-based future, MIDI was taken up by the manufacturers as the standard communication method. So this is pretty amazing if you think of it in today's world. You had all these different companies making all these different products that they were trying to get out into the marketplace, and it was only through coming to an understanding that it would be beneficial for all of these companies to standardize the communication between the actual synthesizers and drum machines and what have you, that would actually move the industry forward. Also around this time, this was the time when the synthesizers started to get a lot cheaper. So synthesizers were going from being tens of thousands of dollars to being a couple of $1,000s, which meant that younger people could afford to buy them. Bands that, you know, weren't absolutely enormous at that time could also afford to purchase them. And so lots of different musicians were getting hold of synthesizers. Okay, a bit more on MIDI now. So here's an analogy in regards to what MIDI is. You can compare MIDI to a TV remote control. So a remote does not transfer sounds or pitches. It lets you set the channel on your TV, set the volume, brightness, etc. So MIDI is the same kind of deal. You can set channels, volume, and other parameters on the sound module or a similar device. So MIDI was designed for use with keyboard-based musical instruments. So the message structure is oriented to performance events, such as picking a note, then striking it, setting typical parameters available on electronic keyboards. So for example, to sound a note in MIDI, you send a note on message, which then assign a velocity, which determines how loud it plays relatively to the other notes. Now, MIDI is obviously great for musical instruments, but it's also very commonly used to run things like light shows, for example, at big concerts, big performances, which is fantastic if you're needing to send out some MIDI information for your visuals for a live show. So yeah, MIDI can be very useful for that as well. Anyway, let's move on. So the very first MIDI keyboard. This was released in late 1982. I think it was December 82, and it's the legendary Prophet 600. This was designed by Dave Smith, who was not only a pioneer of synth building, but one of the original founders of the MIDI protocol. So Dave Smith was one of the manufacturers who came out and said, we need to get this working together. He actually presented a paper to the AES in the United States. I think it was in 1981, presenting how MIDI should work, the first draft, so to speak. And so he was a pretty important person in the development of MIDI. Dave Smith's company was called Sequential Circuits. You can still buy Dave Smith keyboards today. There's O2, which is very, very popular at the moment. Yeah, so he's still in production today, which is great. So some other early adapters, the Roland JX3P. This was released in 1983, and the JXP was a great synthesizer. Not a great financial success for Roland because there was a little bit of competition at the time. And it was also around the time that Roland was doing its Juno and Jupiter series keyboards as well. So somewhat overlooked the JX3P, but it was a fantastic synthesizer nonetheless. The mighty Yamaha DX7. This is the quintessential FM synth frequency modulation. So this was affordable for regular musicians, just a couple of $1,000. It was a digital synth using frequency modulation and has been heard on thousands of 80s and 90s songs. So really very, very popular synth and really changed things up in the market. You would have heard this many, many times. There's been many emulations of this. Most famously would be the Native Instruments FM7, which has now been upgraded to the FM8, which is a part of Native Instruments complete set and a very faithful emulation. It's actually so good that it can actually read the patches that were made for the original DX7, which is pretty interesting. Yeah. So we now had MIDI and we now had computers and keyboards speaking with each other, but we really needed a great way for them to be controlled. And the big step here, after a couple of other attempts, there was the Commodore 64, of course, but then along came the first computer to really embrace MIDI, and this was the Atari 520 ST. This was released in 1985. it was the first computer to have MIDI ports built directly into it. So no converters required. You just connected your MIDI-enabled keyboard directly into your computer, and away you went. So this was a really massive step towards the type of production, DAW style production, that we use today. Yes, the Atari 520 ST was a really big step. So 1989 was a big year. This was the year that Cubase arrived on the scene. Cubase for Atari. Now, before this, there was I think Pro 16 and the Pro 24, which were made by Steinberg, the same company who made Cubase, but it was pretty limited. But when Cubase came out, it was the first real time that lots of different musicians could really jump in and start using a computer for their songwriting. It was a really big step. It was released in '89, as I just mentioned, but this was just when the Atari released the 1040 ST, as the name suggests, the number suggests, double the power of the 520. And as a bit of an interesting note, with the 1040 ST was actually my first computer for writing music. But this Cubase was later followed by the Mac version in 1990, and then in 1992 had the first version to handle audio and a Cubase for Windows. So essentially the DAW revolution had arrived. So next up, during the 90s and the 2000s, the DAW market came alive through some landmark moments. So let's go through what those moments were. So first up, audio for sequences. In the early 90s, computers were now becoming powerful enough to put to work as audio recording devices, with Cubase, Sound Tools, the Pro Tools predecessor, and Logic all taking audio on board. So before this, all that computers were able to do was give the MIDI information for the notes. So if you wanted to control a drum machine, you could use your computer to control the drum machine and even control the different channels on the drum machine. But you were recording you were controlling an external device. You weren't controlling internal devices. And if you wanted to record, you had to record to tape, because there was no way to record into the computer. So that started to change in the early 90s, and that was a pretty big step. So next up was the rise in the power of sound cards. So in 1991, the Creative Sound Labs Blaster card was updated to 16-bit 44.1 kilohertz stereo. So that was CD quality recording in your home. So you had these two massive moments, these two step forwards happening at around the same time. Recording audio and also the quality of the audio being at CD quality, which was pretty amazing stuff. Next up, we had VST. So in 1997, Cubase announces the virtual studio technology. So now audio can be manipulated inside the computer. So this was absolutely massive step. You could actually control things like EQ, compression, so on and so forth within the computer, reverbs, delays, and this was the real start of something big, because within a very short period of time, lots of other manufacturers had jumped on Cubase's introduction of the VST. Yeah. So In 1999, the next big step was the first plug-in instrument. And once again, it was Cubase that was leading the way, with the first plug-in instrument, Neon, which was a very basic synthesizer, an emulation of an analog synthesizer, of course, as you can see there. Range, waveform, low frequency oscillator, detune for oscillator 2, cutoff and resonance for your filter, and ADSR and a VCA. So yeah, really basic, but an absolute massive step, and the start of how we understand, to work within computers. It can't be understated how incredible this was at the time. It was an amazing period of time to be actually writing music. Yeah. So next up, in 2000, Propeller Heads released Reason. So this was the very first version of Reason. Was the virtual rack was what made it so popular. If you understand that beforehand, everybody who was working within electronic music was buying synthesizers and sound modules and drum machines and controlling them from the computer, now these things were inside the computer. So this was very confronting for some people and difficult for them to get their heads around. Now, the GUI of the virtual rack was very comforting for the skeptics of this sort of technology, because it was now possible to write an entire song in the software, and you could actually load in units. So, we need a synth, here's a synth, we'll load that into the rack, we'll turn the rack around, and we'll plug it in. You can see the cables there hanging out of the back. And this was a very familiar way of patching instruments in together and having them work. So it's difficult to overstate how influential this was for electronic music production. It was the democratization of music production had really begun, because here you had a software that was only limited by the power of your computer. You could have as many drum machines or synths as your computer could handle, and instead of having to go out and spend thousands of dollars on each sound module, you just opened up another one and got to work. So yeah, a really, really big step. Next up, 2001, the launch of Ableton Live. It was a whole new way of writing, and audio loops could now be played in a non-linear fashion. And electronic music producers could now think about their productions as non-static pieces, things that could change. Suddenly we were released from the timeline, as in events would happen at this point in the song, and that was the only time they happened. Now we could start to have flexible control. Ableton was originally designed as just a looping tool. I say just, but a looping tool for live musicians to jam along and be able to play their different backing parts, or different elements while they played a live keyboard over the top or what have you. But as we know, it has evolved. Well, I think, yes, we're right up to version 9 now, so it's evolved over time and become one of the most powerful production suites around. Yeah. In the meantime, Logic was moving along at quite a rate. Logic was manufactured by a company called eMagic, and eMagic had been, eMagic had been a big competitor to Cubase, and in 2002, Apple bought the rights to Logic. This was a big shake-up, and over the next decade, Apple's development and aggressive marketing could see Logic actually came to dominate its old rival, Cubase. So Poor old Cubase seemed to get left in the dust for a while. Um, in recent news in regards to Cubase, Cubase got bought by Yamaha, and in recent times has been making a bit of a comeback on that market. And the latest version of Cubase is an excellent workstation. And good to see a company with such a legacy getting really back into the game in a big way. But in the meantime, back to Logic. We've seen Logic grow and grow. It's up to version 10 now, and comes with an incredible palette of sounds and instruments, all working within the box. And it was, as I said before, it was in 2002 that Apple bought Logic, and it started a whole new lease of life for that program. One other thing in regards to Logic was really seen as a fantastic sequencer for MIDI. It had really well developed MIDI editing processes, and lots of people who were very synth orientated really enjoyed that. And even though it was handling audio as well, it wasn't known as the best audio engine. Pro Tools, on the other hand, really did have the audio world in its grasp. So Pro Tools HD was also released in 2002, and Pro Tools had a 192K in and out and an HD core and processing card. So Pro Tools offered the most powerful processing on the market and was accepted as the industry standard in professional studios worldwide. So this was a really powerful step for Pro Tools. And Pro Tools, they had their consumer market and their professional market. So their consumer market was running from the M-Box or the 002 and later on the 003 sound cards, which were perfectly fine for the time. But for professional studios, it was the HD racks which really did the business. And being the industry standard, you could actually work on your if you had Pro Tools at home, you could work on that project and then take that project to a professional studio, and it would open up in the HD version of Pro Tools. Now, one thing that's worth mentioning here is that Pro Tools was also locked to its hardware. So you had to have a Pro Tools sound card to run Pro Tools. You couldn't have any other sound card. You had to have their own hardware to make Pro Tools work, which was a great protection against piracy, and a very interesting business model that they held for quite a number of years. Now, the last two versions of Pro Tools, they've actually dropped that requirement. So now Pro Tools can work with any sound card that you want to use. And this decision, I think, was made because Logic was getting a real stranglehold on the consumer market, and Logic was then seeming to move into studios as well. And basically Pro Tools could see, or the staff at Pro Tools could see, that the home market was becoming more and more important, and in fact it was actually becoming the biggest market by far, and they had to keep up with the times and open up their software to being used by any sound card. So yeah, very interesting developments on this side. So what is coming next? What's the future of this production? Well, As the computers get more powerful and cheaper, we're seeing the possibilities come to light in a way never seen before. The processing abilities of DAWs with new features like pitch processing, direct note access, offers virtually unlimited amounts of MIDI and audio tracks, makes the home computer truly a professional studio environment. So this language that I'm talking about here, or how I'm talking, this idea of the professional studio environment from a home computer, this has been talked about for nearly 20 years. It's actually really come about in recent times. That's actually where we're at now. So very interesting development over the last 30 years or so. But we're also seeing the rise of a new audio workspace. So Android and iOS platforms are really growing in popularity, and we're seeing new instruments, DAWs, hybrid PC iOS platform instruments, and MIDI controllers take over as the portable and playable weapon of choice for a whole new generation of performers and producers. Now, to give an idea of how that's changing, it's becoming more and more acceptable now to see tablets being used in performance spaces and now being used in production. So, for example, if we think about the for iOS, there's a whole bunch of products like the iMachine, for example, which can be you can start your production on your phone, sitting on the train, riding home. You can think of some beats, you can tap out some rhythms, play some simple chord progressions or what have you, and then when you get home you can then transfer that information to your PC and open up the actual machine program and continue working on that on the full-blown program. So this kind of idea of being able to create music anywhere and music really being portable is really, I think, the next step of iOS, of EMP, electronic music production. So let's have a look at a few of these devices. So we've got Propeller Heads Figure. So Propeller Heads, they are the company that made Reason to start with. So they've got Figure, which is a great fun musical tool. iMachine, which is a picture of the next one there on the right there. Very, very powerful sampling and workstation for your iPhone or Android device. Reactable Mobile, which is the picture there on the bottom left. Now that one there, that's a amazing different way of looking at synthesis. So you basically have objects that interact with each other, and those objects can be filters or LFOs, so on and so forth. Just amazing stuff. The Korg IK oscillator, which is once again by a traditional manufacturer. Korg, made a long history of making synthesizers and were right at the front of MIDI back in the day, and they now have the Korg. They now have this fantastic device for your tablet, the IK oscillator, which has synth parts, guitar plucks, sample sounds, effects, hundreds of bits and pieces. And last up there, we've got on the far right hand side, bottom right hand side, is the Beat Wave, which is a fantastic new way of creating your own rhythms and moving forward with that. Yeah. So MIDI control, now, as we know, within DAWs and within iOS, and the rise of how we control these products has come all this way, and it can only be wondering how far it's going to go into the future. Stay tuned for the next video.